ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. It's been a busy week, but it's a wonderful way to end the week, if I may say so. I'm absolutely delighted to have Melinda Gates with us today for what I hope will be an interesting conversation. I'm sure will be an interesting conversation. And we're especially pleased, I think, as you all know here, Melinda Gates is the winner of the Chatham House Prize 2014, voted by our members in the wonderful Chatham House way. So it's doubly pleasurable, therefore, to be able to have our members with us today, to be able to share in conversation with you, Melinda, and for us to be able to talk a little bit about all the things that you've been doing and which were at the heart of why our members voted for you as the winner of the prize this year. So in any case, first, welcome. Great to have you here. Thank you all very much for joining us today for this conversation. And what I'd like to do is first to say a couple of words of introduction, to remind everyone this is on the record, fairly obviously. It's also being live streamed, so welcome to our members who are joining us from outside the building today. Melinda Gates is co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and has therefore dedicated her life for, I'd say, a good of the last 15 plus years to the priorities of the foundation, which I think are known to all of you here. They've been encapsulated broadly in this idea of improving equity in the United States and around the world, and helping people lead healthy and productive lives. Challenges to many in the world, even though we tend to take them fairly for granted here in the United Kingdom and in many other parts of the world. In terms of the prize this year, we, in putting her forward to our members along with the other candidates for the prize, noted in particular that you, as co-chairman of the foundation, have played a particularly important role in really raising the bar on philanthropic humanitarian work. And the foundation really now does stand out as a top standard for the kind of role that non-governmental organizations can play. And I think it's wonderful to be able to recognize that activity that you've undertaken, known especially for its work in the field of health. But in your case, and I think this is what really appealed, I'm interpreting, but I think to our members, is the focus that you've put on the issue of the role of women and children. And as we sit in our nomination, in particular, the roles you've played on increased access to family planning, newborn interventions, reducing maternal mortality and mortality of newborns, life-saving vaccines, and improving nutrition. So that has been obviously a key part of your work. I think it was also noted, though, as well in the nomination, the role that you've played in the issue of family planning. We'll come to it in a minute, Melinda, the conversation about empowering women. But one of the ways of thinking about empowering them, and you chaired the London summit here in 2012 on family planning, with this goal that you set and the summit set of delivering contraceptives to an additional 120 million women in the developing world by 2020. Technology, there's all sorts of other areas you work in as well. We'll get to those, but I wanted people to understand the context under which this prize has been awarded. As I said, we're delighted to have you with us here for that. I'm going to do a few questions, then we'll get everyone here involved. First question I wanted to be able to ask, specifically, why the focus on gender in the last year or two? As I said, it's a foundation that, to those who maybe don't know the world as well or don't know the foundation as well, I include myself, we tend to think of the Gates Foundation as a health foundation. Obviously, women are a key part of it, but you've really put an emphasis on gender. What's pulled you into that space?
Okay. Well, let me start by saying, first of all, thank you to interviewing me today, but really thank you for the award. It was a huge honor when I heard about it this spring that I would be awarded at the Chatham House. And I certainly know of the amazing work that you all do, not only inside this building, but around the world. And Chatham House first came on my radar because in the very early days of the foundation, we were having a big meeting, a lot of outside experts to come in and brief us on something. And somebody from the foundation staff said, well, this is under Chatham House rules. And Bill and I said, what's that? And so they told us, and as soon as we were finished with the meeting, we went back to our desk and we looked up a lot more information on Chatham House. So
good. That rule is brilliant, whoever invented it.
And yet they don't apply today, right? Yeah. How did I get that? So to your question on women and girls, So the foundation has been at this work now for about 15 years. We'll celebrate our 15-year anniversary next year as an organization. And you're absolutely right that we have taken this primary focus at the beginning on health. That is, we took a very economic focus when we started the foundation about where are the biggest deaths and disabilities around the world, both for adults and for children. And you can go down basically and look at what kills adults and children or disables them. And we looked at the biggest diseases for adults, so HIV, AIDS, malaria, TB, those jump up at you. And in children, it's not having access to vaccinations, the basic vaccinations that you have in the UK or we have in the US. But the biggest killers of children were pneumonia and diarrhea. And there were no vaccines for those. And it was unbelievable to us that kids were still dying in this day and age of diarrhea when you get it in the UK and you go down to the drugstore and you take care of that problem. So we started with that disease focus. Yeah. Over time, what we have moved, we still have that disease focus. We then added on some pieces about when you get somebody to the point where they can live a healthy life, how do you help them lift themselves up out of poverty? So we started to add on some what we call productivity work, like agriculture. We can talk about that more later. But besides doing great science around those diseases, and when I talk about we today, anytime I say the word we, I mean it in partnership with many, many people. We do nothing as a foundation by ourselves. It's always in partnership. But as we did that science, we started to realize that to be able to have the greatest vaccines in the world, if you couldn't deliver them, if you couldn't get a mother to accept putting the polio drops in her child's mouth, I don't care what great science you have, you're going to fail. So we've shifted our work where we're doing that, but we're making sure we can deliver it. And that's been a real learning piece for the foundation. But as I've been traveling for the last 15 years, I meet all the time with families on the ground, whether I'm in rural Africa, whether I'm in the slums in Nairobi, the slums in India, in Bangladesh. I sit down and I like to talk to people because you learn so much. And if you talk to the men and the women together initially, but then the men go back to the fields and the farm and you stay and talk to the women, what you learn is absolutely incredible about their lives and about their lives and what their dreams and hopes are for their children and what their role is. And so as I looked at the foundation's work, and Bill and I have over the last 15 years, we say, if I say, how in my lifetime can I double the impact of what the foundation has? It's by taking this gender lens and focusing on women and girls. And if we can lift up women and girls to be not victims, but agents of change, you'll get not only the other half of society working, women, when they get economic means in their hands, they get educated and or get economic means in their hands, the way they plow it back into their family is different than men. So for every marginal pound a woman gets, she puts 90% of it back into her family. So if you invest in a woman, you're investing in everybody else. And so for that reason, we're taking this gender lens.
I'm not going to make any comment on what that says about men and how we invest our money. But
and let me just say, when I talk about women and girls, we need men and boys to help with this. We can talk about the societal issues, but men and boys have to be part of the equation, right? They have to actually sign up for this to allow their wives, just like in the UK, to decide that women can and should participate. But when men know that their children will survive, they make a different decision about that.
And I think and I want to come back to this as well, the socio-cultural dimension of the work. Because as you said, as you kind of almost went forensically down from the big goal into each of its constituent parts, you start to see how they're connected, and then you work out where the pressure points are strongest. And I do want to come back to this part of how you balance almost the family relationships up. And let me just go back first a bit to women's reproductive rights, fertility. This is the big issue of the London summit. I presume, therefore, that women who are empowered are ones who can choose when and where they have children, or when and if they're going to have children. And has this been, again, one of the pressure points that you thought, right, the role of women is incredibly important for development, women need to be empowered, but then how do we empower them? And I suppose whether they're mothers, not mothers, how they're mothers becomes a critical part. Is that why the focus so heavily on the fertility issue, sorry, not just fertility, on reproductive rights, access to contraception? What's the hook there?
Okay. So again, when we started the foundation, the premise that the foundation has been started on that carries forward and will carry forward even through our lifetimes is that all lives have equal value. All lives, no matter where they're lived on the planet. And yet we know that the world doesn't treat all lives as equal. So when Bill and I started the foundation, the two places we started to learn were about reproductive health and vaccines. We got away from the reproductive health because of some internal foundation reasons. We didn't have exactly the right team or structure to do it. We started working on vaccines, and then we took, as I mentioned, this disease focus. But it's always been there, and it's always bothered us in some ways that we weren't working on reproductive health. And as I would be out meeting with women, after I would be there and I would ask my questions, and all they knew was I was there to as a Western woman, a pair of khaki pants and a t-shirt, to listen, right? They didn't know, they knew I came from the US, but they didn't know what I was doing. If I would ask them about vaccines for their children, the shot in the arm for the children, if I stayed long enough, the women would say to me, but what about that shot I used to get? Why when I go to the clinic, I can't get it anymore? Why did I have to walk 20 kilometers in the heat with my baby on my back, and I go and it's not stocked in? And what they're talking about is the main reproductive health tool used in places in Africa is Depo-Provera. It's a shot that women get every 3 months. And the women use that shot because it had been available, for one, but number two, it's covert, and so they have control of it. And so when I would come back, I was shocked how much women knew about reproductive health in the developing world and were asking me about it. But when I would come back and read the global reports, if you looked at the highest level, it said contraceptive tools were stocked in. Well, because of all the work that's happened with the Global Fund and AIDS, the US program, the President's Emergency Plan for Aid Relief, we were stocking in condoms all over Africa. We actually have condoms now. But women will tell you over and over again, I cannot negotiate a condom even in my own marriage because I'm either suggesting to my husband that he has AIDS or that I have AIDS. And so the rallying cry that I was hearing was true. We had actually let this system crumble, and so we weren't putting out the tools that women wanted. And to your original question, if a woman can space the births of her children, and she can decide if and when to have children, she is then able to feed each child as they come along and decide whether she has enough resources to feed the next one and how to store up resources together with her husband or by herself to educate her children. And women will tell you worldwide, it is my job to feed these kids. Yes, my husband goes off and gets some economic means, he's helping me, but at the end of the day, I'm the one at home deciding of the resources I have, who gets to eat in my household. And the woman often eats last. So, when I came back and thought about our situation in the United States or the UK, what allowed women to go out and work in the workforce? It was being able to space and choose if and when to have children. And so we need to do that for women around the world. And it will not only lift up themselves and their families, but then you lift up a community and you lift up an economy. So if a country to move, as we know, from low to middle income country, if they can take advantage of that demographic dividend, that is, have a populace that moves through the population when they get from age 15 to 29 and they're healthy and they're educated, they can lift up society by economic opportunity. But reproductive health is a huge piece in that link.
Let me just pick to one other point that you mentioned, I think, on passant early on, which is the education part of this. In a way, you are, through the things you've described so far, allowing women to give a better chance that their children will survive in countries where this is, a core issue, where they themselves can take care of their own health. They can manage, as you said, their kind of household budget, their household time better. We're talking, though, about a world in which the role of women as agents of change and not just being healthy, but being the agents of change with that health. Yeah. So I presume this is where the education part comes in. Now, I don't imagine the foundation is going to do everything. And there's plenty of people who work on the education part. But where's the foundation? Where do you personally, I suppose, see the education part for women and girls coming into this? Because there are amazing statistics about the greater amount of economic income that women can achieve for each extra year of school, 10, 20% per year, as I understand it. Where do you find the education part fitting into this? Are you partnering with others to make sure that those healthy women then get a chance to do more with their lives? How does education fit into this?
So the way I think of this women and girls space, because it's enormous, right? And there are so many different places you could intervene. I think of it basically in 3 buckets. I think of it as health, that you have to have a healthy life and start a healthy life to be able to do some of the other pieces. But health, Then I think of, does a woman or a girl have decision-making power? Can she make decisions about her own life or her family's life? That's the second bucket. And the third bucket I think about is economic opportunity. That is, can she get some means in her hands to lift herself or her family up and get on the way to reaching their potential or self-sufficiency? So when I think of those three buckets, education is a huge piece of this, a huge lever, because if we can keep her in school and get her through school, her ability to have economic means goes up dramatically. But the other really interesting thing about education is if a girl is educated, the entire way she accesses health for her family changes. And we don't even know that, we know about 6 pathways of why we think that happens, but we know it absolutely happens. We don't know if it's because all of a sudden she has literacy skills, or she's used to dealing with somebody in authority and asking questions. There are a whole bunch of reasons we think that's true. But we know that the way she accesses health gets better with every year she stays in primary school to the late years, but it changes even more if she stays in secondary school. So as a world, we need to not just look at, are we getting parity, gender parity at the primary education level, which we're getting close to as a world, but at secondary school, are we getting girls into secondary school? Are they staying and persisting? And is there any quality, both for girls and boys? We need to look at the quality issue of secondary school. But that's why it's so fundamental for girls, because of not just the economic piece, but the health piece, and then again, the way the health pours into the family. So as you said, the foundation can't do everything, but we are partnering with others, and quite honestly, everything we do as a foundation, Bill and I think of as a learning journey, and we're learning a lot more about the education space. And we also, whenever the foundation ever goes into an area, and I'm not saying we're in education or that I know when or if we'll be there, but whenever we go into space, we always think about what's the foundation's unique role, so what could we do uniquely that somebody else can't do, and what are the levers of change that you would actually pull to make a huge difference? I think I could already say that the wrong thing to do would be to go build what we have in our United States education system in Africa. That would not be the right thing to do. It's not succeeding for our own country right now. But 2/3 of our kids in our country aren't prepared to go to college when they come out of public school. So that's another place that the foundation actually spends money. But anyway, so the education piece is huge, and I think we're learning more about that for all the reasons that I mentioned.
And let me just, one other point that you mentioned earlier on that I wanted to come back to, which is the socio-cultural context. Because you said each time you peel back the problem, the onion, trying to get to the core of it, you find another lever or another problem. Now, the socio-cultural one strikes me as particularly interesting. You know, if women are educated, if they're able to control their reproductive lives better, the economic opportunity starts to come. But in the end, culturally, the role of women in the family as a bread earner or not, who looks after the purse strings, who doesn't, this must be something that in a way is unavoidable. You might say, we'll leave education to others. But if you are doing your work, I know you've partnered, for example, with the Grameen Bank and trying to think about ways of trying to get women more actively into the space of then, in agriculture in particular, being one of the agents of change in terms of producing food. This must be incredibly difficult in societies where the man's role is ultimately the dominant role. Can you deal with this? Is it just the reality and you have to step back and let things happen? I mean, how do you handle that?
So you have to absolutely understand the cultural context in which you're working. And you have to find people on the ground who are actually coming from those villages, right, and have them work with you. But the interesting thing is, if you approach these problems from the right angle, and sometimes you have to start with the men, and explain to the men why their children will be healthier and will live longer and be able to go to school, and you help them understand the benefits for their family, it changes their mindset about what they'll allow their wife to do. So I'll give you an example. In Niger, highest fertility rate in the world, highest desired fertility rate in the world as well. Men and women say they want to have a lot of children. But the way the Nigerians are going after this problem of introducing family planning, because the women are already hearing about it, and actually I asked a group of women, I said, who knew about family planning and were starting to use it, I said, will you all spread this? And a woman said to me, you know women. She said, we talk, and we talk, and we talk. We talk at the well, we talk when the babies are born, we talk when we grind millet. So we will spread this idea. but our husbands also need to be educated. And so what the Nigerians are doing is they've created a husband's school, and they're teaching the husbands first why their children will be healthier and live better, especially under the age of 5, if their wife isn't having one baby right after another. And so when the husbands understand that concept, they sign up more, and they more readily will go for it. That's just one example. I could give you so many more. The other thing I will say, though, is we have to look at, as you start to empower a woman, what are the unintended consequences that also happen in her community or in her family? So a woman will tell you sometimes when she gets economic means in her hands, let's say she actually starts to run a very, very small business, a little kiosk or a stall. Sometimes that benefits her because she has more respect, she's looked at in a different way, she feels good, she's empowered. But sometimes her husband is jealous of it, and it creates more violence in her family. There's also the situation where other men will want to marry her because all of a sudden she has means. She also gets the situation where family members want to come take over her business. Right. So you have to, while you're training her and helping her lift up in her business, you have to look at the unintended consequences and work on those too. And again, you have to do that in culturally sensitive ways and bringing men into the conversation about, again, why will this be helpful, not just for your wife, but for you and for your family.
Let me just switch a little bit onto two other things. I mean, the two big things that are changing the world and transforming sub-Saharan Africa, where we focus a lot of our commentary, though I know you do a lot of work in Southeast Asia and other parts of South Asia as well, around the world, as well as the United States. But the things that are changing fundamentally the world right now, probably two: technology, which you know from your time, obviously, in the business, and your MBA and all the things you've come to this from a business perspective, I presume, initially. But technology is changing not just the way business operates, but the way countries operate, the way individuals can empower themselves, and urbanization, which is, again, such a different context. These are two very big issues, and I don't expect you to cover them entirely, but just as a snippet, how are technology and urbanization either separately or even interacting in ways that are maybe making your foundation's work more difficult or easier?
So let me take the technology piece first. The mobile phone offers so many opportunities in the developing world, and I'm not talking about even a smartphone at this point. They're still using the plastic phones that we used to use. But so the incredible thing, if you think about mobile money, it is happening. In fact, the first time I saw it in Kenya years ago, I came back to, Bill was still working at Microsoft as CEO, and I said, Bill, the thing you wrote about in one of your books, I got to tell you, it's actually happening on the ground in Kenya. And Kenya, now 90% of households have a digital wallet, and that is they transfer money on their phone. In Tanzania, 46% of households have mobile money. Philippines, it's taken off at scale. Tanzania, it's taking off now at scale. Tanzania, $1 billion moves every month through the cell phone service. And so people are not only moving money and spending money through their cell phone, but they're actually starting to save on their cell phone. Now here's the thing, again, why I think you have to take a gender lens on this work. Still, when you look at mobile penetration, it's huge across the developing world, but 20% of women still don't have access to mobile money, to mobile phone.
Oh, right.
So when you roll out a mobile money system in Bangladesh, for instance, the disparity is even greater. 70% of men, 72% of men have access to a mobile phone in Bangladesh, 44% of women. But then when you introduce mobile money, you start to get 30% of men participating and 13% of women. And so if we just talked about, the thing we just talked about, economic opportunity and the empowerment and the way she pours it back into her family, we have to make sure women have access to mobile phones and to these services. So the mobile phone gives us an enormous opportunity. I mean, some of the things that our partners are doing are incredible about training healthcare workers and women over the phone about certain health needs for women and children. So it gives us this opportunity, and then we have to make sure we get it into everybody's hands so it's an equalizer. So that's what I would say about mobile technology, and there are many more tools, but I'll stop there. And then urbanization. Urbanization, you're absolutely right. It has pros and it has cons to it. But I think the chance that urbanization allows us to do is something like family planning as a for instance. You can work at scale in the largest slum in Nairobi and really take it to scale. And because of the migration in and out of that slum and the moving on, the women spread it far beyond the boundaries of even peri-urban Nairobi. It goes out into the countryside. And so because you're not working in all these disparate remote rural villages, the scale can actually happen quicker. And we're seeing that also in some issues with family planning in Dakar, Senegal, and other places. Now we, the Dakarian government, the Senegalese government, are scaling out in Senegal, and we're seeing it permeate to other places in West Africa. The amazing thing going on in Africa right now is countries are learning from one another. So where Rwanda has a really well-developed health system they've set up in Ethiopia, Rwanda's had the steepest decline in childhood mortality in the face of the earth ever. And so lots of African countries are going there to understand how do they do it at the economic level that they're at and how do they replicate it. So this scale of urbanization also helps us replicate inside of a country and get scale, and then other countries come and learn.
One last question, then I want to open it up, 1:30. So we had the pleasure of our patron, Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth, come here on Tuesday evening. And afterwards, she met with a number of people at Chatham House and others, but she had an interesting conversation, which was reported loudly, with David Heyman, who heads up our Center on Global Health Security here. And it was a very interesting conversation because she raised the issue that she was very concerned that the impact of Ebola might overshadow the kind of continuing devastating effect of diseases like malaria, which has been a core focus for your foundation. And that potentially, as David has written and others have written and they discussed, that the weakening of the health systems that's been affected by Ebola could knock back a lot of the progress that had been made in tackling some of these other diseases, including malaria. How vulnerable do you think is the progress that has been made? Because I think there's no doubt you've been talking about it, and part of the rise of Africa that is taking place right now, of sub-Saharan Africa, with real opportunity emerging, has been partly around the health side, and these things are working. But how resilient are they? How vulnerable are they? How worried are you that what's happening on the Ebola front right now, could it strengthen the health systems, or might it knock them off?
It's in these countries that we're talking about that
the specific three, I suppose.
The specific three, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. It is knocking down the health system flat. And that's what's the biggest, well, the huge problem, obviously. My first concern is the families that are affected by Ebola. That is just tragic for any family to go through it. But the second order question is, what it's done to these health systems. There'll be almost 800,000 births this year in those countries. The women aren't going to clinic now because, one, the clinics are being devastated, but two, they're terrified to go that they're going to get Ebola. What's the biggest killer of women today, age 15 to 29? Childbirth. So 800,000 births. Let's talk about what's going to happen to maternal mortality in those three countries. Malaria, the Queen is absolutely right. People aren't going in for malaria treatment. We can treat malaria today. 3 million people are alive since the turn of the century that would have had malaria, didn't die because we have the right treatments now. We have a diagnostic and treatment, but they're not going in for treatment because of Ebola. And so I think the most instructive lesson that's coming out of Ebola is if you can get these health systems at the most fundamental primary level working, like I talked about in Rwanda. And when I talk about primary health care, it's a little clinic that honestly is not even twice the size of this stage. And it's usually manned, by 2 women. And at that primary level, that's where a woman comes in to get the services she needs. Family planning, vaccines, birth, she comes in there. Well, why did Nigeria, we got this case that came across the border in Nigeria, right? One of the most terrifying things for the world is when it came to Lagos, a city of 22 million people. Do you know what would happen to us if it had broken out in Lagos? Well, what happened in that case, because there was a strike in the health system, the person that had it didn't go to the normal place. They went to a different clinic that was open. The clinic that was open saw that it was Ebola and not malaria. It's a miracle. They understood it was Ebola, and then they took a little tiny primary health care clinic that was actually set up for polio, and they converted it within 24 hours to be an Ebola emergency response clinic. And they did all the contact tracing to find out exactly where that person had been, and they quarantined everybody that had been in contact. That's why we only had 20 cases of Ebola in Nigeria. But So if we had the right health infrastructure in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, we wouldn't have gotten to this case. And now the health system will crumble and have to be rebuilt. So you've got to get the primary level and all the secondary and the tertiary levels all set up properly, but then you can contain a disease like this and not have the system crumble. And so that's where the world is going to have to go next, is really investing in primary health care.
And as you said, make them resilient with this as the lesson, of what to avoid. Look, thank you very much for those first thoughts and great thoughts. Let me open it up and get some comments, questions from people here in the room, and make sure that you just say who you are. Apart from just being a Chatham House member, we assume you're mostly Chatham House members if you're here. I saw that hand go up first. He's got a bright light on you as well, which makes it easier. And, yep, to the middle. Yep.
Howard Hudson from United Nations University. Just this week, we celebrated World Toilet Day. Now, I know that the Gates Foundation sees this as a priority, partly because it covers so many fields. I mean, health, obviously, but also personal safety for women and girls, as well as development, mainly through the maintenance and repair services. My question is, can we do more in terms of local capacity building, in terms of investing in social ventures for this maintenance and repair?
Absolutely. And I think if you want this whole system up and running in toilets, it's not just about the toilet, the technological toilet we're trying to build that's a non-flush toilet. You don't want to build flush toilets, just for the audience, all over the world. It's expensive and it's a waste of water. So we're trying to come up with scientists with a new toilet that will help family. We have to place in the right place for women and girls, but that helps the family. So not only do you not have the disease spread and you deal with the feces in the right way, but you don't have the smell, and you can actually reuse some of that waste as fertilizer or energy capacity. But it's not just about the toilet, as you're saying. To get it up and running and to get it self-sustaining, you have to build the whole ecosystem in the country, and you have to build up the people around it who will sustain it. And so the partnership that we're involved in with doing that is not only looking at the toilet, it's looking at the ecosystem around it, and it's also looking at very small processing plants. So you don't build this gigantic processing plant, but you build smaller processing plants in the community, and it becomes a business for people as well. And then you work at the business locally of the pickup and the storage and moving the matter around. So that's all part of it. The place that this is happening that's pretty neat already, even without the new toilet there, but the ecosystem up and running that we're pretty excited about is Dakar, Senegal. And it's the local business owners who are turning this into a business for themselves. And then they're using computers to actually find out where they need to do the emptying of the sludge around. And if they can really pull the demand together, it becomes a business because they can go out to one part of the city and there's so much demand now. Instead of it being there's demand here in the city and demand over there and demand over there, and so by the time I drive my truck around, the fuel cost isn't worth it. But if I can group up the demand on a given day, you can actually create a business for lots of entrepreneurs, and it's really happening.
Wow. Well, that's good news stories. Nice to have good news stories at Chatham House. Right, first the gentleman there. I'll come to you a second. Yep, you, sir. The microphone's coming. Microphone's coming.
Member of the Chatham House, yeah. I'm working on a petition to pressurize government in Pakistan and Taliban to allow the polio vaccination campaign go on. And the challenge is that the polio workers are getting paid around $2 a day, and they put their life, on the line, vaccination people around in different cities and villages. My question here is, I know there's a lot of work done by the foundation to help that, but probably how do you see that work continuing in terms of eradication of polio? Because the last thing we want is polio on the same scale as, God forbid, like Ebola, and things are not looking pretty at the moment. So what's your comment on the polio situation, basically? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the foundation has a goal of eradicating polio off the planet, and it will be only if we get it. David Hyman has been deeply involved in this work, was for many years. As a human race, the only disease we've ever eradicated is smallpox, and we are at the end of the mile in terms of polio. And so the goal right now, so India became certified polio-free. It's been polio-free now for 3 years, and it's certified. The lessons that came out of India, getting it out of there. So there were only 4 countries left that were endemic countries. If you look back even 3 years ago, it was India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. And so what we're incredibly focused on right now at this moment, now that we've gotten it as a world out of India, is Africa. And Africa is really interesting. We're taking the lessons from India. Nigeria, we had 53 cases of polio last year in 9 states. We've had 6 cases of polio this year in 2 states, including the one that Boko Haram has been.
So despite Boko Haram?
Despite Boko Haram and despite the horrible attacks on vaccinators that have happened there and in Pakistan. So if we can get polio out of Nigeria, it will stop breaking out. We'll stop having pockets of polio then in Africa that break out. They're all from Nigeria. If we can get Nigeria done this year, then we can concentrate on Pakistan. Afghanistan, everything that comes there is from Pakistan these days. It's just the cross-porous border. And so we are working, as you said, very, very closely with the government. And Pakistan government does not want polio in Pakistan. They don't want it to be the last place on earth that has polio. So they are highly motivated now to work on this. And again, really learning what some of the global lessons are with GPS mapping, but they have the tribal areas that make it tough. But I think we will get polio done in the next few years, and hopefully we'll get down to it being just Pakistan, and then we'll rid it, which will be amazing.
Great. There's a question right there. Yep, and I'm seeing lots of other hands going up. I'll probably start grouping them soon. Yep, I can see you, gentleman there, who's got your hand up. I see you, and I see you.
Thanks very much. Ronan Tynan. First of all, I want to congratulate you on winning the Chatham House Prize, and I must admit you have greatly surprised me today by the explosively political nature of your address, because I do too, I'm quite familiar with the slums in Nairobi, I have to be honest, because I was a little while ago involved in making a documentary called Mothers Against the Odds, which was about a very important issue you've touched on, the very high rate of maternal mortality. And the thing that really impressed me was how amazing these women are. And I know I regret that might sound patronizing, but the way they can organize themselves when they're given half a chance. You have touched on something. I actually thought in my naivety, and I tell the story against myself, I might actually be telling you that today, but in fact, you have floored me by your understanding in that regard, because that's the key thing, the investments you are making because you're empowering women. And the name of that documentary, and I want to just, final point, Mr. Chairman, is that the co-producer on that was a woman called Anne Daly, a multi-award winning feminist, and although it might have been done without me maybe, but the thing is, again, it just reminded me, listening to you, that when a woman says what you have just said today, and in the same way that Anne Daly in pressing for that documentary, it does make a difference. And thank you very much.
Thank you. You don't have to lean any further forward. You're going to knock the person in front of you over. Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. And by the way, you can all see that documentary for free, and I'm not promoting it.
You've used your time. Right. Very good. Thank you. If you pass the microphone back, actually, just back behind the lady in pink. Behind. Thank you.
Crispin Ellison, Oliver Wyman. We've seen in the last few months this year the extraordinary sort of collapse of the global response and its weakness and lateness, the global response to, around Ebola and health security. People getting involved very late, very ill-coordinated way. Maybe we're beginning to get on top of it now. Do you see any role in your foundation in starting to address some of these sort of structural weaknesses which potentially have catastrophic consequences?
Well, I think besides the lesson of primary health care coming out of Ebola will be this lesson that the world has learned about paying more attention to pandemic epidemics. This one is obviously a liquid-based, blood-based, et cetera. An airborne pandemic is something that we don't want to face as a world, and we need to prepare for it. And I think there have been other diseases that we actually did prepare for well, like SARS. And so I think there will be a lot of global discussion about how we start to really plan ahead for pandemics. That's what's to come next, I think, after the Ebola piece. But it won't be just us. We'll help convene some of those conversations, but a lot of it will be convening at the WHO, at CDC, at the partners who've worked on the ground, and we'll be part of the conversations. That was true in the SARS. And the piece we are always trying to just remind people, even as we were preparing for SARS, is let's really look at poor people too. Let's not just stockpile for the UK and the US and Japan, but everybody else. But we'll be part of that, and if it doesn't happen, we'll also be part of making sure it gets on the agenda, because it's important.
I've got my next question, so lots of hands going up. Don't take them all. Actually, it was somebody. I'm staying in the middle where I've seen them grouped, and I'm coming to this side, and then I'm going to that side. Yep.
Thank you. Anne Cormack from Rolls-Royce. I was lucky enough this summer to be present at an event where Malala was giving a speech. A young lady who exemplifies the kind of courage and precisely the sort of things you're trying to achieve with your foundation. Malala is famous rather for the negative side of what she's been doing, and that is the threat to her life that was not only there but carried out, which she thankfully survived. I wondered if you had something to say about the dark forces in the world that are still there and that are very clearly there in the Middle East, which Malala has faced and hopefully will not have to face again.
Yeah.
Well,
The safety issue.
The safety is huge. The violence for women around the world is huge, both at that scale, but even in their homes. I mean, the sites we're working in some places, we actually are, again, because of this gender lens, we're not just measuring the outcomes that we're trying to get, but we're actually starting to ask the deeper questions, like about violence in the household, and it's astounding what we're learning about that. And the thing I want to say first about Malala is she wants to take that, though, and really lift all girls up. Like, her whole message is about, don't look at just me and what happened to me. That was tragic, but she's getting her own education, and her whole foundation is going to be about lifting girls up with girls' education. So I think that's what she ought to do, and it's miraculous. She's an amazing person. But then I think on all of these issues about violence and issues, there'll be shifts on these things, and part of it, again, is education. And part of it is getting these issues to come out in public. We still have these issues in the UK and the US, right? There's still violence against women and girls in our own country, and boys and men at times. So having it be public, but where I see the most change that's coming is when you get villages to come together and plan as a village and start to say, we're not going to allow that anymore. And some of the greatest change I've seen is when a village starts planning around a woman and a child's health, and they say, we're going to commit to getting our women to clinic when it's time for them to deliver. They start to plan differently. And the village says, the men say, gosh, we didn't plan the transport. Oh, we need to make sure the money's there. Or we need to make sure the motorcycle's there. Or the village will say, but okay, when the river rises, we don't have a bridge. We better commit our resources to building a bridge. Those villages, as they ask themselves the deeper question, they eventually hit on violence. And a village will say to themselves, and I've seen this over and over again, they'll say, we don't want violence in our village, and yet we hear it in people's homes. And the men will start to say, it's our job to stop it. Only we can go knock on the door and say to that man, that is not okay. And so when you get these things, when you get public commitments from a village to change things, it's amazing how deep it goes, and that's what gives me optimism. And I am starting to see some of these self-help groups, not just women's, but we're starting to see more that either include men or sometimes include the mother-in-law in India, because she's the power structure. But we're going to start seeing them at scale. The Indian government has a commitment in the two northern, most populous, most poor states to scale up in the next 5 years. They want to scale up over 5 million women's self-help groups of 20 people each. That's when you start getting scale, and those groups will scale to other groups. And that's when you start education and you start changing things for men and women.
Right, I'm taking a couple of questions from here. I'm coming to this side, and then I'll move around. Lady there, yep. Sorry, can't see you properly from here. Thank you. If you take the microphone, if you don't mind.
My name is Anne Leslie. I'm a veteran foreign correspondent, worked in 70 countries so far. And you and I, 2 years ago, were guest editors on the BBC 4 Today programme. We all here admire you enormously. But I've worked a lot in Africa and in the Middle East. And are you as dismayed as I am by the decision in Egypt to let off the father and the so-called doctor who had performed FGM on some girl who died? Because you're told, and I worked a lot in Egypt, that you have to have FGM, A, because it's Islamic, which it isn't, and secondly, because it copes with female lust. The problem is not female lust, it's male lust. So are you as dismayed about that? And do you have to campaign on FGM?
Well, first of all, let me say this. I thought what the UK government did last summer to really bring forward the issue of FGM and early child marriage and early child marriage to the forefront was incredibly important. And I think in places like Egypt, having it come out in public that somebody got off on this is really important. Just like you're seeing in India, the violence against women, it's coming up in the news and it's being reported regularly, not just once, but on a continuing basis. I think that's how you get social change and you get crowd. But you also have to have the people in the country say, we won't accept this. The piece that I see that's positive, that we can get a positive change on FGM is if you meet with the hierarchy of the Muslim leadership, they say, just as you said, it's not in the Quran that you need to do FGM. It's not. And they'll tell us, we've been working with them actually in Senegal, and they'll say, we can get it out through our whole network. We have to get it down at the village level, that imam, to tell men and women, boys and girls, that it doesn't have to be there.
The only thing is, I would say to you, is you talk about empowering women through education. A lot of my Egyptian women friends, because, you know, it has a very high degree of FGM in Egypt, I think the highest there is in the Islamic world. They are people who went to Harvard, they went to Oxford, they had gone through this. They were educated, but they've said to me, particularly after this particular judgment in the Egyptian courts, we can't actually get rid of this ridiculous and disgusting practice. And they are empowered, but the society isn't.
Okay, I'll let you hold that. Thank you. Question, front microphone coming down here in the corner. And then coming to this side of the room here. Well, I'll get you as well, but you weren't first on my list, I'm afraid. I've got two others.
Hi, my name is Trisha de Boergrove. I'm married to the director.
I like when my husband introduces himself that way, too.
With all the comments about men so far, I can see I've had to let this question in.
As David said, he's married to me. Last year I heard, and I'm sure you know about Matt Damon fronting the big charity called water.org. And it was very enlightening in the sense that, as you well know now, that individuals can make a difference in terms of being independent and going into certain African countries and really making change without any real relationship to the government. And I know you've talked about certain African governments in a very positive note, but are governments feeling, what is your relationship to most governments? Are they emasculated by what's happening? Like you've been very clever not emasculating the male population in certain villages, in certain areas where you have to change culturally what's going on. What is your general relationship to governments around the world where you're making these enormous changes?
Great. So we have the belief that as a foundation, that all a foundation or a philanthropy can do is be that catalytic wedge. So a foundation can take a risk where a government can't or won't take a risk. And we can try things, we can try innovations, some will fail, we're willing to let some things fail. But at the end of the day, if you want to talk about scale, if you want to talk about lifting up, Bill and I are interested in lifting up hundreds of millions of people's lives, end of the day, you have to work with government, because it's government that has that scale and that can scale it across a country. Both the donor nations, so the UK and the US and others, coming in with money, it takes that kind of scale money, and then it takes the money and the commitment coming up from the nations that are being helped. The best thing we can do, for instance, in health is work through the governments. Like Ethiopia is setting up its health system, and they are very, very systematic. They went and learned from Tamil Nadu, India. They learned from Sri Lanka. They learned from other places. And so they're setting up their system, and then we slot in the various places that the various partners can play. And that's true of Rwanda as well, and that's why they're getting such change. I just don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it's scalable or sustainable if you're not working at the end of the day with the government. And yet you can't, I won't say that everything can work through the government at the get-go. I mean, the vaccination work that we're doing in polio is in concert with the government, but it's not through the government. So it's tricky.
Good. Yes, first the gentleman there with his hand up. Microphone's coming to you, sir. You've got it.
Hi, I'm Ashish Goyal. I work in the financial markets. Thank you for what you've just told us, because coming from India, I relate to all that you said about women and how helping a woman through her health and education can change her life, her family, and her community. Just on the same, not at the same scale, but similarly, there is an issue in countries like India where disabled people go through maybe even more social stigma, and they don't get access to any of these resources because they are even considered below the other, whether it's gender or other races. Is there anything that you might be doing in the future to work with disabled people?
We don't work on everything. So on the disabilities, as I said, when we originally took this death approach, we also took a disability approach. We said that is, where is somebody out of work because they become disabled and then they can't work? So what Bill and I always try to do is look at the disabilities and say, how can we work upstream on an issue like that? So for instance, in some of the maternal work that we do, how do we get a woman in the situation where she doesn't end up with fistula? We work upstream of that, and fistula is something that you get when you birth a child if things don't go well for you and you rip, and then the rest of your life you're ostracized from your village because of the smell that you have. And so if we can work upstream on an issue like that and give girls family planning so they don't get in that situation, it's mostly young girls. But so on the disability issue, the way we try to work on them is work upstream of that, but we don't work on specific disabilities today.
Okay. Gentleman in the front row first here. Now, you've got 3 more before I get to you. I'm sorry.
My name is Samuel Davis, member of Chatham House. My questions rest on Ebola technology and feedback. I've been with I'm from Sierra Leone origin. I've been with most of my colleagues from the directorates of various NGOs, and most of what they come and tell me is that there is a gap particularly at the bottom level. And if there's a way by which your foundation can assist in filling those gaps, I think it will go a great way forward, particularly through technology. I have a comment on that, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the place that the foundation is working on Ebola, we did some of our emergency, it's the biggest emergency response grant we've ever done. And the first part of the grant was to move supplies as quickly as we could. That was a piece of the grant. The rest, the large majority of the grant that we're spending money on is exactly on the technology pieces that you're talking about. We're working on a diagnostic so we can detect Ebola, do the test on Ebola much more quickly than happens today so you know whether you have it. We're working on that piece with partners. We're working with a set of partners on the drugs, getting something in addition to ZMapp and also trying to get enough ZMapp to get it scaled. And we're working with the partners on vaccines. The other piece that we're doing, though, is we were just involved in making sure that several blood mobiles went from the US to Africa, because if I've had Ebola and you haven't had it but you get it, if we have the same blood type, we can take my antibodies and use them for you. But if you don't have a blood mobile to do that, you don't have that capability. So that is actually work that's going on now. And then the last piece is to try and get a specific, what they call pheresis machine, an antibody machine where we can collect everybody's antibodies who's had Ebola and skim them off and create a pool of antibodies that we could get back to Ebola patients. There's only one pheresis machine that exists on the continent of Africa, and that's in South Africa. And so we want to get one into West Africa so it can be used not just for this, but for other diseases as well, like hepatitis A or MERS. So that's another piece we're working on.
I'm going to pair up a couple of questions here and then there. So first at the front, please. If you could bring the microphone right to the front. This lady's been waiting patiently. I may get you, sir. I'm not sure.
My name is Samal Salman. I'm originally from Khartoum, Sudan, and spent a lot of time in the US. My question is, I read an article in Time magazine where, I don't know how accurate it was, but where you spoke about how women limit their own opportunities, and especially women who come from educated and affluent backgrounds. And then you spoke a little bit about how you were reluctant to take on the role of, leading the family planning initiative, and that you eventually took on that role. So I'd like to ask you your advice for women like myself who are trying to carve their own directions. What is it that allowed you to take on that role, and what advice would you give?
Could you hold that thought for a second?
Sure.
I'm just going to take group last two together. Yeah, please. Right. Actually, please talk.
James Thacker. I've consulted with 10 human rights groups since the Soviet period. When you're talking about scale and money, you're talking inevitably about confrontations with corrupt governments. If you deal with the governments, that deals with the scale, but you also have to help a lot of people in the field. Going back to the Hoover period, the Carnegie, there's been an incredible, where you have that kind of money, you have corruption, the money disappears. How do you train people on the ground not to create resentment? Because you're almost coming in a level of alternative government. How can you do that without, we've got the Chinese and the Russians vying now. There's a huge amount of resentment of them and the way they built infrastructure. You're, in a sense, building infrastructure. How can you do that? I'm as an American, I want you to really to succeed, How can you keep the operatives in the field? You must have huge, you haven't mentioned the numbers. How many people have you got on the ground in the field? And how do you train them to deal with local cultures, not to create that kind of resentment and conflict and loss of money?
Two big questions. I'm going to try and squeeze two more in before the end, so good luck. So the first one was on your own experience as a woman.
Oh, you want me to answer both now? I thought you were going to group
no,
two
no,
more.
don't worry.
Okay,
No.
good. Okay,
No, don't worry.
Okay, so I would just say this: use your voice. Use your voice in your leadership, in whatever capacity you have it. It makes a huge difference in the world, and you never know who you're going to influence. Whether you influence a room of 100 people, or you influence a room of 1,000 people, or somebody on the ground to then use their voice and get their agency going. But I think it's a lesson that I learned late, actually, in my position, and I sort of wish I had learned earlier. So use your voice, and you won't be sorry that you did. To this issue on corruption, I think this is one of, there is still corruption, I will tell you that. But I think this is one of the things that feeds into this message that we need to update about that foreign aid is a waste of money because it curries so much favor and there's corruption. That is true under the period that you're talking about. When Bill and I wrote our annual report last year for the foundation, we wrote about 3 myths. And one of the myths we wrote about is that foreign aid is a big waste. And because people have this myth in their head that it curries favor and the corruption that used to exist still exists, they think that the foreign aid investments aren't making as huge of change as they are.
Big debate here.
It's a huge debate. So why we've cut in half the childhood mortality rate, that is, children who die under the age of 5 has been cut in half since 1990. Why? Because of foreign aid. Because foreign aid funded something that the British government and the US government and us and many others have been very generous to, this global fund, Global AIDS and Vaccine Immunization Fund. Getting vaccines out to children that work here and creating new vaccines is the big thing that got that childhood death rate down, as well as getting out malarial bed nets through the Global Fund. Those things work, and those multilateral organizations now have mechanisms built into their measurement to understand when is there corruption. And I won't say there hasn't been any under those, but boy, do we go after it as soon as we see it. And then to the backlash question, you just have to really work on the ground and bring people in who are working with you that are partners on the ground. So it's not just a WHO representative coming in from Geneva, right? That there's on-the-ground cultural people working, and that helps a lot.
And I know that the foundation's invested a lot actually in local organizations and so on, so this is a key part of that message. The last two questions, lady there and the gentleman here. Yeah. Yeah, microphone's coming. You might need to stand up, we can't see you. Yep.
Hi, Karen Rudish, Fire Direct Consulting. I would love to hear about some of your issues that you're working on closer to home. You mentioned education in the US. We obviously have a very big issue with poverty in a lot of first world countries.
Right, and if you could just hold that thought, and last question here.
Thanks for squeezing me in. David Pollock of Concilium Capital. You're obviously best known as a grant-giving foundation on a hugely impressive scale. I'd be interested in your interactions with impact investing funds.
Okay. Okay, so let me take the first question. So outside of the United States, which is where the most money goes from the foundation, really is global health and global development. Again, to the point of all lives have equal value, and the place we really started there was health and then lifting people up. Inside of the United States, the biggest investment we make is in the US education system, because Bill and I feel that every child in the United States ought to have the chance of a great education, and that's our biggest inequity in our country, that we shouldn't have a system that graduates kids from high school and 2/3 aren't ready to go on to college. It makes absolutely no sense. And the biggest lever in that is getting a great teacher in front of the classroom. And if you do that, is unbelievable how much gains they can get with the right tools in their hands as well and the right teaching instruction, the gains they can get from kids no matter what the zip code is that they come from and no matter what their background is in poverty in the situation around them. And it's not that you don't have to address some of the poverty issues around too, but boy, the teaching gains and getting those to stick is possible with great teaching. And so we've been very involved in that work, not just at the local level, but district level and state level. And then to the question of impact investing. So besides giving out grants, the other thing that the foundation does is we make investments, PRIs we call them, into organizations that we're trying to help if they're creating a business, let's say, of a new drug or a new way of doing mobile banking, we'll make that kind of investment into them. We'll de-risk it by sometimes taking the riskiest piece of the equation so they can then get funding from other organizations and institutions and banks to come in. So we're doing that actually far more, and we'll use our balance sheet actually to de-risk some of the equations too in terms of the funding. So we've done a lot more of that in the last 5 years, and I can talk to you about offline the specifics if you're interested in that, but we use that tool as well.
Melinda, you've been so efficient with your time that, and you're direct with your answers, and I don't want the last question to be from a man. And I think there was at least, there's that woman there who was waiting most patiently. So I think we'll let you have the last word. You can use your voice. Here comes the microphone.
Hi, my name is Eliza Daniel. I'm involved in a social enterprise in agriculture in Africa and Senegal. And things have been coming a bit slow in terms of getting something of a scale into a country that can be prosperous through agriculture. What measures does your foundation do to speed up the way that agriculture becomes a strong foundation for prosperity?
Yeah, and you mentioned nutrition, so I'm pleased we're able to get a question in by nutrition
and
right
nutrition
at the end.
and agriculture go hand in hand. I'll just take the agriculture piece, so I don't have to do both. But on agriculture, so one of the things that we're very involved in is we have an organization on the ground called AGRA in Africa, which is trying to take the best of the Green Revolution lessons that come out of South America and China and take those to Africa and to scale them. So one of the things they're doing is reopening the seed systems in these countries at huge scale. And then to take the gender lens on it, we're trying to make sure that the seeds, when we get a new drought-resistant seed where you can get a bigger yield on your farm when you're getting less rain, we're trying to make sure the agro dealers, they've traditionally just reached the men. We're trying to make sure they reach the women farmer because there are actually more women farmers than there are male farmers in the developing world. So we're getting new seeds coming out. We're getting a drought-resistant maize. We're working on the cassava diseases, which isn't a very popular crop in Europe or the United States, but it's the predominant crop in Africa. We're working on a variety of rice that actually can stay flooded for 2 weeks because the rains are coming later, and when they come, they're coming longer. So you have both flip sides of the equation, and then we're trying to get them out through these seed systems at scale.
Look, Melinda, thank you very much indeed. Wow, you took on a lot of questions. I lost count of the number that we did there, and I apologize for those who we weren't able to squeeze in, but you really took on every question and hammered it. And I'm glad that we got to hear your voice, your vision, and your impact, and the impact of you and your foundation, your husband, the whole team at the Gates Foundation, because we don't often get to talk about good news opportunities at Chatham House. Inevitably, we're warning about the future or warning about what's bad going on at the moment. But there are, although a lot that's bad and a lot that's difficult and a lot that's tragic you have to work with, you are able to share with us stories where difference has been made, and that's hugely powerful, I think, for a group like this. Tonight, we will have a chance to celebrate your achievements and the choice of our members of you as the winner of this year's Chatham House Prize. Tonight, those of us who are there will get a chance to have a drink and to toast you. I have to say, those of our members who are here got to hear you in action. And so I'm very pleased that you came, that you asked such good questions, and that you gave us such a great performance. Thank you very much indeed. A strong hand for Melinda Gates.